Old games on new consoles is nothing new, but I always thought it was cool when an old game got a complete makeover or a big gameplay change that made it feel fresh and new. Even if it wasn't the best, I appreciated the effort the developer put in for trying to redefine a stale experience. The Dreamcast was no stranger in this regard, and I've chosen an 11 game series that had been around for a while, and then got a brand new look and feel on Sega's last console. There's actually some good stuff here, so let's get started. If you grew up in the 1980s, chances are you've played Atari Centipede at some point. Originally released in 1981, it was one of the standard bearers during the golden age of arcade games. The premise was to shoot down an oncoming centipede while enemies and mushrooms littered the playfield. Leaping Lizard Software took that classic premise and gave it a massive update for the Dreamcast. This time, it's a fully three-dimensional shooter where you can navigate the entire play area while dealing with your enemies. This time, you have missions to save people and property, as well as power-ups to increase your weapons. You can even jump to get to higher ground. Back in the day, the reviews for this were vicious, with just about every publication under the sun hating on it. So much so, I never touched it. Years later, I gave it a go and found it nowhere near as bad as it was made out to be. It takes some getting used to, especially how quickly the camera spins and how the enemies flood the play area, but this is actually completely playable. The visuals don't do it any favors, as the PlayStation roots are obvious in every polygon model you see. If the 3D adventure mode isn't to your liking, it does have a classic option that is much more akin to the original arcade version. The entire package isn't grade A quality, but there's still a bit of fun here if you like a challenge. It was only released in the United States. Frogger was a huge part of the early days of gaming. In 1981, Konami blessed arcades with it, a simple tale of getting your frog across streets and swamps in one piece. You wouldn't think that just moving a character across a play area would be fun, but this was about as addicting as early arcade games could get. In 2000, Blitz Games, under license from Konami, developed Frogger 2 Swampy's Revenge. This is a sequel to the 1997 Frogger remake, and while not the first time Frogger had gone 3D, it was the first time he had adventured outside of the typical cross-the-street and river gameplay. Here you have bigger jumps, more enemies to deal with, more things to collect, more environments to explore, and many more ways to die. The story has a bad guy kidnapping all your offspring, and you and your family has to get them back. Hidden all over the play area are your children, and you'll need to do some exploring to find them all. I enjoyed this one quite a bit once I learned how to play it. You need to be patient and watch the enemy patterns, taking your time to not overshoot your pathway. Seriously, if you play frustrated, you will likely die many times in a row as you fall into bottomless pits and run into enemies because you pressed the directional pad one too many times. And speaking of that, this only uses the digital direction pad to move around. You really do need to learn to finesse this, or death will come quick and your tolerance will be tested. If you get lonely across its 30+ levels, be sure to bring your friends and family, because this sucker supports 4 players at once. It's another one that was only released in the United States. I was always fascinated with Gauntlet in the arcade. It was released in 1985 by Atari, and you could always hear it before you saw it. The speech was so loud and there was so much of it. This was cool as hell at the time because not many arcade games did that back then. This was a dungeon crawler where you needed to find keys and food while battling hordes of enemies and looking for the exit. The multiplayer was incredible and supported as many as 4 players at once. In 2000, Midway decided to bring their arcade update to the Dreamcast, and it again includes 4-player co-op. Once again, you are venturing through maze-like arenas that are full of traps, secrets, enemies, and all sorts of things to discover. Like the first, you need to destroy enemy generators to stop the enemy spawns, and there are switches that need flipping so you can open pathways. There are also new classes of heroes to use, and the Dreamcast has new levels exclusive to this version. It's not the prettiest thing on the system, and it can chug quite a bit in spots, but there is a ton of replay value here, especially the more people you play with. There are some issues with repetition, and this can be really hard at times, but keep at it, and you'll find a great multiplayer adventure that does the arcade original proud. The history of Miss Pac-Man is quite the tale. To sum up, it wasn't developed by Namco, and it was insanely popular when it was released in 1982. It was, of course, a sequel to the original Pac-Man, one of the best-selling arcade games of all time. There were many spin-offs and reissues over the years, but I was quite fond of the Dreamcast release called Miss Pac-Man Maze Madness. Namco had a company called Mass Media do this one, and it was released in 2000. It takes the old-school formula and turns it on its head, with bigger stages, puzzle-like obstacles, and brand new enemies. Eating dots and power pellets are still a big part of the gameplay, though there is a lot more to do now. There's blocks to push, explosives to place, and locked doors to open. It's now fully polygonal and the visuals aren't bad at all. In fact, I think this is the direction Namco should have gone with the series, advancing at each generation with new mechanics and bigger and better mazes. Sadly, this was only ever released in the US for the Dreamcast, though it did see wider availability on the PlayStation. Reviews were all over the place, with some saying it was fun and others saying it was outright trash. There's quite a bit more to this one than you may have initially given it credit for, so definitely give it a shot and find out for yourself. When Qbert was originally released in 1982, it was an absolute mystery to a 7-year-old Sega Lord X. I had no idea how to play it. It really did seem this little dude went every direction except the one I wanted him to. Every credit I put into the machine was a complete waste, because death followed seconds later each and every time. When I played the Dreamcast version in 2000, I was hoping to figure out what I had been missing all those years ago. Nope. Even with this new version developed by Artec Studios and published by Hasbro Interactive, I still suck to high heaven. For what it's worth, the level design here improves things, with more complicated layouts and new enemies to avoid. The gameplay itself is mostly the same as before, though you do have an adventure mode where you can play the areas in any order you want once you unlock them. I could sit here and bash the hell out of this, but I honestly was just never any good at Qbert, so I feel that would be disingenuous to the people that are actual fans and took the time to learn it. I could never wrap my head around that isometric gameplay and how you move block to block. But if you enjoyed it, old Qbert here may have something to offer you. There's a 2-player mode in there as well. Tetris is a classic that most people have played at least a few times in their lives. I know when I got my Game Boy, I spent countless hours with it, and even got my mother to play it a bit, a woman that despised video games in just about every form. When the Dreamcast released, it received not one, not two, but 3 Tetris games, all by different developers. The first of these was Tetris 4D by Bulletproof Software. It's a pretty standard version of the game with a classic and versus mode, and not much else. If you like the core Tetris experience, it's serviceable enough, but nothing really exciting beyond that. It was only released in Japan, so some of you may not have played it yet. Our next entry is Sega Tetris, developed in-house by Sega themselves. This was a port of a Naomi arcade game and takes some real liberties with the presentation. It has single and multiplayer modes and even supported the link cable and modem. Unfortunately, it was only released in Japan, so it may be another one you haven't played yet. Our third Tetris is the only one to see release in every major region outside of Japan. The next Tetris was developed by Blue Planet Software, and my favorite of the 3. Released in 2000, it supported online play in the US version, and has a new puzzle mode where you must piece together broken lines. If that isn't your thing, there is a classic mode here as well. Unfortunately for these 3 games, Tetris didn't see any real advancement beyond the presentation and a few interesting modes, so you may want to skip them if you didn't care for Tetris to begin with. The original Alone in the Dark was a real watershed moment in gaming for me. It was one of the very first games that scared me. It was released in 1992, at a time when scary games were pretty much non-existent, at least the ones that really had any true potential. There's real tension here though, as you had no clue what was around the corner, just waiting to make your life difficult. I played the 3DO version quite a bit, and it's directly responsible for my initial interest in the Resident Evil series. In 2001, it was brought back with a complete makeover and called the New Nightmare. No doubt trying to be more like Resident Evil, since it had a ton of success by that point. The presentation undergoes a massive renovation and is darker and more sinister than ever before. Gameplay sees less change but still has great variety with 2 playable characters, lots of different items and weapons to find, and of course plenty of otherworldly enemies to run into. This was definitely not a bad game, but it was hugely overshadowed by the Resident Evil titles in both gameplay and design. This was after Code Veronica, so it had some pretty stiff competition on the same platform, not to mention when parts 2 and 3 showed up. You really need to take this one on its own merits to enjoy it. There's a decent game in here if you give it a chance and not compare it directly to the more popular Capcom series.
Who are you? I do not recognize the sound of your steps.
Konami's Track and Field series of games have been around since the arcade version released in 1983. It was a group of events where you often needed to rely on finger speed and timing to get the best results. In multiplayer, it could be an absolute blast. The Dreamcast version went under the name ESPN International Track and Field and showed up in 2000. It's essentially the same thing as before, but with a radically improved graphics engine and support for 4 players. As a big fan of the NES games, I really enjoyed this. There are 12 events ranging from the 100-meter dash to weightlifting. It reminded me of Decathlete on the Saturn, though it doesn't play quite as well. The biggest issue is that you really don't get things fully explained to you in some of the events. Some of the timing is poorly exhibited and leaves you to guess, resulting in countless failures until you learn the ropes. It doesn't ruin the overall experience, but can be quite trying at times. The models could also have some more polygons, especially at the hands. The real fun of this is definitely at the multiplayer level though. No joke, you get some friends or family together with this, and you can pass some serious time with it. Fans of the classic arcade and NES titles should really enjoy this the most.
The distance of the second attempt was 100.77 meters, and that's a new world record.
NBA Jam was a 1993 arcade game that took basketball to all new heights of fun. Featuring 2-on-2 over-the-top action, it was ported to just about everything, and rightfully so. It was a huge hit, and something that even non-sports fans could wrap their heads around. It underwent a few upgrades and changes over the years before landing on the Dreamcast as NBA Showtime, NBA on NBC. Midway took the original, upgraded the graphics to polygons, and really made a fine showing here. It supports 4 players, over 130 real NBA players, and allows you to create your own. While this wasn't NBA Jam's first excursion into polygons, it was by far the best of them. The players and arenas look great, and it runs smoothly as well. But it's that classic NBA Jam style gameplay that will keep you coming back for more. To date, I don't think there has been a better pick-up and play experience that has been so accessible to just about anyone of any skill. Your kids, your friends, whoever you can get to hold the controller beside you will pick this up in minutes. It was a fantastic follow-up to NBA Hang Time and a damn fine addition to your Dreamcast library.
Oh my! Howard? Howard? And it's good! Finds Hardaway! Hardaway? Whoop!
I always enjoyed a good game of Bomberman. The series started way back in 1983 on Japanese computers, and I played it for the first time on the NES. It was pretty simple. Enter into a closed arena and attempt to blow up the enemies. Over the years it got deeper with power-ups and game modes, but the core fun always remained. Hudson Soft did a Dreamcast version called Bomberman Online in 2001, just for the US market. And like the games before it, it was a multiplayer juggernaut. They also moved the graphics into fully polygonal arenas and players, while adding a number of different rule sets for the matches. Survival is last man standing. Hyperbomb is collecting 3 target icons and getting to the exit gate first. Submarine is planting bombs that reappear on your opponent's side of the arena. Panel Paint is coloring as many panels as possible with your bombs. And finally, Ring Match is a battle royal style contest where you are in a tiny arena trying to blast your opponents out of the ring. There's also a battle game where you can adjust various rules, and there is a create a player option to customize your avatars. All in all, it's an excellent entry that really doesn't get the love it deserves. Sadly, the online features are now gone, but it still supports 4 players locally, so there is still much fun to be had. Bomberman is on everything, and this Dreamcast release is still among the best. Our last game I just want to touch upon briefly, as it's a great lesson in the struggle some two-dimensional games had switching to fully three-dimensional engines. The original Prince of Persia first showed up way back in 1989, a cinematic platformer that had you avoiding traps and fighting enemies in an effort to escape a dungeon and rescue your princess. When a sequel popped up in 1999 with its first effort in 3D, it was a Tomb Raider-style adventure that had you pushing and pulling blocks, swimming and climbing ledges in similar environments. That PC version was then ported to the Dreamcast a year later, called Arabian Nights. It's not a great experience, particularly when compared to later 3D entries in the series, but it's still a really interesting game. It definitely gives you Tomb Raider vibes, right down to the frustrating deaths and checkpoint restarts. Visually, it's not terrible, but the environments come off a tad sterile. Magazine reviews were quite divided as well, with some enjoying it and some really hammering it. It was ported by Avalanche Software and only appeared in North America for the platform. Not great, not terrible, and a curious entry to a series that would go on to great things just a few years later. Of course, the funny thing about this episode is that it's been 20 years or more since these games were released on the Dreamcast, so they've seen additional entries since then. I've always found this to be an exciting part of the hobby, old games being reborn into something new, something different, and sometimes something incredibly fun. It doesn't always work out for the best, but sometimes you need to experiment to see what does and does not work. It's easy to turn your nose up at an old IP and dismiss it entirely, thinking you already know what it's about. I know I've done my fair share of that and missed a number of good games for it. Of course, trying out these types of releases doesn't always get a happy ending, but it's still interesting to give them a chance and see how the series has grown over the years. If you haven't tried these, I recommend that you do, if nothing more than the education on how these games evolved console to console and port to port. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.